Thank you, David, and Mark, and the whole staff here at the library and at the foundation. It is a huge privilege to be in partnership and cooperation with you all in raising the standard of biblical scholarship and amplifying global voices like Havila's. So, as David said, Langham is a ministry that believes every church around the world deserves a well-trained pastor. And our mission is to deepen the roots of biblical scholarship in the global church. We do that through a number of different ways, but one of the ways we do that is by identifying and having the privilege of scholarshiping global theologians, global thought leaders to their PhDs. Havila Dharmaraj, Dr. Havila Dharmaraj, who's with us here tonight, is one of those scholars. And these are folks who receive their PhD and return back to the church in their context to raise the standard of biblical teaching, to equip students, equip future church leaders to write books that will change the landscape of the church in their context. So Dr. Havila Dharmaraj is from the boisterous, bustling, vibrant city of Bangalore, India, which I had the privilege of visiting in October. I got to spend a week with Havila. I got to eat chicken biryani from her kitchen and pick fruit from her garden, and it was a highlight of my experience with Langham. And Dr. Dharmaraj is writing monumental books for South Asia. She has contributed to the South Asia Bible Commentary, which we might hear about later this evening, but it is a single-volume Bible commentary that is in the hands of thousands of pastors and church leaders in South Asia. And it's the Bible written from the perspective of South Asian scholars. So Dr. Havila Dharmaraj contributed to that. It is monumental. It is changing the landscape of the church there. So tonight we have the privilege of, if you've been to Avatar or a recent 3D movie, not putting on our 3D glasses, but putting on the lenses of South Asia. So we get to put on a new pair of glasses tonight and get to experience God's Word from a completely new and different perspective. So our prayer is that you would be enriched by Havila's wisdom and insights tonight, and that you would go home and seek out more ways to put on the glasses of the global church, to hear and be enriched by the wisdom of the global church. So it is my absolute privilege to welcome Dr. Havila Dharmaraj. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you. The book of Ruth. There is a character in the book of Ruth who persists across all the 4 chapters of that book. And that character is a collective one. That character is community. Now just think of the structure of the book. Ruth and Boaz dominate the middle 2 chapters of the book, but on either side, they are encircled by their families and by generations that precede them and succeed them. The proposal of marriage, for example, is a declaration that's made in the town square before an assembly of townspeople. Community blessing showers down on the marriage like confetti in a present-day wedding. The baby born is named by the neighbors and last seen in the arms of his grandmother. The narrator coos over his cradle the names of his descendants to be, for in his family line lies his greatness. Set into families and clans and moored into a small town population, segueing on either side into the bloodline of a tribe, and setting itself into the history of a people group, this book is history with community at its heart. It is for these reasons that South Asians can tumble out of their everyday world straight into the world of this story. In the speeches that its characters make to each other, in the joys and sorrows of its protagonists, in the values and priorities it articulates, Ruth's colors are recognizably Eastern and its texture familiarly Asian. From having read the book of Ruth as a South Asian woman, I present this evening Three elements that particularly interested me. First, the theme of widowhood. Secondly, the circumstance of childlessness. And thirdly, resistance to the popular characterization of Ruth. So to begin with, the widows, Ruth and Naomi. The first 5 verses of the book take us at breakneck speed across a decade in the life of the family of Elimelech. Elimelech leads his family from famine-stricken Bethlehem to Moab with its promising fields of grain. The family emigrates to escape death, but death follows them to Moab. So you have in chapter 1, verses 3 to 5, the following text. And Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left, she and her 2 sons. They took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. And they lived there some 10 years. And then both Mahlon and Chilion died, and the woman alone was left without her 2 children and husband. The text describes Naomi's situation at the start and at the finish of the decade. She was left. The Hebrew verb here is sha'ar, which means to remain, to be left over. Now, used sometimes for the one bereaved, it is more often used to describe those who have survived a disaster. For example, the ones that made it through the flood, those whom Joseph saved from the great famine, those who returned from the Babylonian exile. So it is in this deeper sense that Elimelech and his sons are survived by Naomi. Naomi, who outlived her husband, it's a situation that's bad enough in a patriarchal culture, now outlives both her children, a domestic tragedy in any culture. Rather than come through these mishaps as the lucky survivor, each bereavement leaves her increasingly lonely and increasingly vulnerable, even more so because she is a foreigner where she lives, and even more so because she has 2 widows dependent upon her. The widow. Now, snapshots of the widow's pitiable condition are scattered across the biblical canon. Here are women who live on the edges of society. They pick up the leftovers of the wealthy. They have legal rights they are powerless to appropriate. If the widow has no son to care for her, her options would have been to sell herself into slavery, make a living through prostitution, or simply die of neglect. In the small town of Zarephath, you might remember, a famine leaves a widow resigning herself and her young son to death by starvation. She is scrabbling for sticks with which to fuel that final meal that she can provide her little family. And then perhaps she hopes to die. And then there is Anna, widowed at what was probably a ridiculously young age after only 7 years of marriage. We wonder if she had anyone to care for her, since we hear that she spends all her days in the temple precincts, fasting and praying. And in those same precincts, while the rich are flaunting the offerings they can put into the treasury, a widow brings all she has, and yet it amounts to no more than 2 very small copper coins, worth only a fraction of a penny. In another town in first century Palestine, a judge attends to a widow's case only because she will not stop knocking on his door with the plea, "Grant me justice against my adversary." Perhaps she is a victim of one of the teachers of the law who, quote, "have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets, but do not blink an eye while they devour widows' houses." Mark 12. The circumstance of widowhood is the image that comes readily to the poet as he describes Jerusalem, fallen to the Babylonian invader, looted and stripped. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she who once was great among the nations. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are upon her cheeks. That's Lamentations 1. So with that, let's return to Naomi. Naomi, who bitterly calls herself Mara. The Lord himself has raised his fist against me, she cries. The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Naomi's words are no hyperbole. They express her theological view as inferred from the calamities that have piled up on her, one after the other. Now, to the ancients, misfortune could be brought about by the malicious intent of a capricious deity. With the late Elimelech's family now reduced to a clutch of 3 widows, perhaps Naomi infers that she is in disfavor with God. In my region, traditional Hindus would describe someone like Naomi as a victim of the god of bad luck, Shani, and would even avoid associating with them. As for a household of widows, the traditional Hindu could not conceive of anything more ill-fated and inauspicious. In some Indian languages, a swear word to use against a woman, any woman, is the word widow. Widow is a curse word. Why? This is because of how a widow is perceived and treated within popular Hinduism. First, a widow is expected to spend the remainder of her life in mourning for her husband. Such an existence entails staying as unattractive as possible. So she is forbidden jewelry, for example. A common funeral ritual for the man will include the elimination of all the markers of the woman who had been married to him. For example, the vermilion dot that is on the forehead, which is a mark of a married woman, that is erased ceremonially. The black beaded necklace that she wears, which is another marker of being married, that is removed, as also rings that she wears on the toes. Her glass bangles are ceremonially broken, symbolizing the end of her life as a married woman. To prevent her from being attractive to men, there was a time when the head would be shaved, and she would be required to stay in that state for the rest of her life. From that point on, she wore no makeup, she dressed as plainly as possible, usually in white. And in fact, white is so associated with widowhood in India that it is traditionally considered inauspicious for anyone but a widow to wear it on a celebratory occasion. And to keep her libido in check, her diet is restricted. Meat is removed, as also certain vegetables, and the frequency of her meals is reduced to even once a day. A second and far more serious perspective on widowhood in South Asia is to lay on the widow the blame for the death of the husband. She is considered ill-omened and someone to be avoided. So much so, she may be confined in isolation to a room in the house. She may be treated as untouchable, one whose contact brings bad luck. Even the sight of her may bode ill, and so she covers her face with a veil when in public. If she should marry again, it is thought that she is sure to pass the jinx on to her new husband, rather like the story of Tamar, Genesis 38, in which Judah is afraid that he might lose his third son to her. The widow must not only deal with her grief at being bereaved, but also carry the staggering weight of guilt at having somehow brought about her husband's death. With all this comes a deep sense of shame, not to be taken lightly in the South Asian culture. A third aspect of widowhood in India flows from these 2 points above, and this is the stripping of identity. Now, since a woman's identity was traditionally derived from that of her husband, a widow ceases to have a place in society. Some communities go even further and dehumanize the widow, referring to her with a gender-neutral pronoun, it. As one Indian psychologist puts it, she is physically alive, but socially dead. She may not have the right to inherit property. With no husband to support her needs, she is passed into the hands of a son or a male relative who might see her as an economic burden. From here, she's only one step away from being abandoned. The pilgrimage cities of Vrindavan and Varanasi are infamous for being the places of choice for unwanted widows. These widows often live in shelters, supposedly withdrawn into a life of prayer, but begging at temples to fend off starvation, and if they're young, finding themselves in prostitution, much as widows in ancient Israel might have done. So arising out of this perspective on widowhood came the practice of sati. Within some Hindu communities of central and northern India, there was a time when the death of the man meant that his widow should ready herself for immolation on his funeral pyre. The practice was called sati and was seen as the highest statement a woman could make of devotion to her deceased husband. More practically, the practice was driven by this rhetorical question: was life as a widow preferable to death? Of course not. Even though sati was banned under the British rule in 1829 and was further legislated against in independent India in 1987, there still continue to be sporadic reports of the practice, even to the present day. So against this cultural backdrop, ancient and present day, we are able to better understand the desirability of the married state. Naomi's one desire is to see Orpah and Ruth married. In India, marriage is seen so emphatically as a woman's insurance against all manner of evils that a bride is blessed with the words, "Stay married forever, sada sumangali raho," which is stay married forever. Among the names for girl babies, a popular one is Sumangala, which means happily married. It was to reverse the undesirable circumstance of widowhood that the Mosaic law included the levirate law, Deuteronomy 25. According to this system, if a married woman dies, leaving his widow childless, the brother of the dead man, that is the widow's brother-in-law, would marry the widow, and the child born to them from that marriage would raise a name for the dead man. You'll remember this comes up again in Matthew 22 when Jesus is in conversation with the religious elite. The widow would have double security, both a husband and a son. But here, Naomi is already old. Am I going to have any more sons? She asks. Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? We know how the rest of the story turns out, and we know that Naomi will miss no opportunity to catch a husband for Ruth. Even if not from her own womb, she will excitedly identify Boaz as a possible levir, kinsman redeemer, and hatch a devious and perhaps even a rather dodgy scheme to compromise him into marrying Ruth. Happily for the culture of the book, the story ends with a widow's remarriage. Now, against this commentary on widowhood and widows in ancient Israel, in first century Palestine, and in present-day India, the significance of a pair of widows cast as the protagonists of a biblical book is not to be missed. For the South Asian reader, it calls for a seismic shift in worldview to appreciate the place of these two widows in God's great scheme of salvation for humankind. Because we know that Ruth will have a place in the earthly ancestry of Jesus. And so we move on to our second theme, the childless Naomi and Ruth. Now, if there had been hope that the passing of Elimelech would be compensated by grandchildren, that hope proved empty. By the time Ruth makes her decision to follow Naomi to Bethlehem, she must have been childless for about a decade. This is in startling contrast to the fertile fields of Moab, mentioned 5 times in chapter 1. Ruth remains barren, while the countryside around her yields. Indeed, even Bethlehem will celebrate a barley harvest as she reaches its gates. An Indian saying goes like this: a house without children is a graveyard. Traditionally, Indians would understand this, childlessness, as the ill luck brought in by the daughters-in-law. It was thought that, or even now it is thought that ill-omened daughters-in-law are those, especially, that are born under the sign of the planet Mars. This is all horoscope reading. Born under the sign of the planet Mars, and they bring with them the inauspicious taint of Mars. Among other things, they are unlikely to give birth to male children, they bring misfortune into the family, they may be prone to immoral behavior even, and they may bring about the death of the husband. All this besides childlessness. Coming back to the childless Ruth. Interestingly, Ruth is referred to as a young woman twice in the book, and each of these instances end with a reference to either grain or seed. First, when Boaz initially notices Ruth in the field, he refers to her as a young woman, and that episode ends with her going back with the barley grain that she gleaned from his field. The second time Ruth is referred to as a young woman, it is at her marriage, right at the end of the book. And the marriage blessing is that Ruth will provide seed. In other words, offspring to Boaz. The story has ironically reversed itself. If the hand of the rich farmer Boaz had sustained the poor widow Ruth with barley grain, now it will be the previously vulnerable Ruth who provides Boaz with seed that will make him the ancestor of a famous family. The reversal of the theme of childlessness is perhaps enacted symbolically at the threshing floor, that's in chapter 3. Now, just before daylight, Boaz asks Ruth to stretch out her shawl as a receptacle for the grain that he wishes to gift her. He probably pours into it as much grain as it can contain without spilling. Now, whether Boaz means it or not, here is a symbol of fertility. Here is a widow who has been childless perhaps for a decade, who is now carrying seed given to her by a man who we know in the next chapter will become her husband. If she was carrying the bundle in her arms, it might even mimic pregnancy. As one scholar says, her bulging apron serves as evidence and as promise of things to come. A rabbinic reading of this text looks far ahead into the things to come and sees the 6 measures of barley that Boaz gives Ruth as anticipating 6 descendants of this union: David, Hezekiah, Josiah, the threesome of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Daniel, and the Messiah to come. The marriage blessing that the community bestows on Ruth invokes Rachel and Leah and Tamar. Rachel and Leah, to whom the 12 tribes of Israel owe their existence. Tamar, the Canaanite, without whose initiative, in the story in Genesis 38, Tamar, without whose initiative the line of Judah would have died out, leaving no possibility for a future royal house of David. In Bethlehem, these names resonate because Rachel's tomb is nearby, and Tamar is the ancestress of the tribe of Judah. And so, in the name of the mothers of Judah, Ruth is wished offspring. A South Asian reader would recall immediately the hyperbolic blessing made on Indian brides. May you have 1,000 sons. It's just hyperbole. May you have 1,000 sons. In Eastern cultures, a high value is placed on progeny, especially on male offspring, since the name of the family and the inheritance passes down the male line. Do all of these emphases on childbearing mean that at the end of the book, Ruth is reduced to nothing more than a uterus? A South Asian would understand this sadly disproportionate value placed on a fruitful womb. Interestingly, in the book of Ruth, it's not simply the childless young woman whose womb, we are told, the Lord opens. In the closing scene of the book, the aged Naomi, who has no surviving sons, is the one who moves to center stage as mother. As in any South Asian household, the baby's birth is reason for the neighbors to visit, but here it's Naomi, not Ruth, who is depicted in joyful conversation with them. Now, this conversation is in striking contrast to a similar conversation that had happened in chapter 1 between Naomi and the women of Bethlehem. In chapter 1, Naomi lamented her misfortune, but now her neighbors exclaim at her happy state. Then Naomi spoke of loss and emptiness, but now Naomi's arms are filled with baby Obed. Then Naomi had asked the woman to call her by a name that looks to the past, Mara, bitterness. But now the same woman called, the verb is the same in both, the same woman called her grandson with a name that ensures her future. Naomi has a son, the women of Bethlehem exclaim in unison, exclaim in celebration. In an extended and legal sense, the baby is the offspring of Elimelech and thus can count as a son to Naomi. May he become famous throughout all Israel, they say, and follow up the blessing with, he will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. The hope being expressed is that baby Obed will crown her sunset years with delight. He will be the mainstay of Naomi's final years. But baby Obed is not the only son that Naomi gains. At the start of the story, she had lost 2 sons, Machlon and Kilion. And now she's compensated in full, first by this baby son, Obed, and by her son, Ruth. Ruth, who loves Naomi and who is better to her than 7 sons. This mention of Ruth's love reminds us of her many acts of devotion to Naomi, those performed while still in Moab, the one performed in choosing to follow Naomi to Bethlehem, and those performed in Bethlehem. While the Israelite canon law prescribes that Israelites should show love to strangers, Leviticus 19, the irony here is that Ruth, the stranger, has shown love to an Israelite. In this, Ruth has proved herself more valuable than 7 sons, 7 being the Old Testament number signifying the ideal or the complete. So if the son, Obed, secures Naomi's future, the son, Ruth, secures Naomi's present. Now, we might ask why Naomi hogs all the attention as the book closes, while Ruth and Boaz fade out of the story. With Ruth finding her security as Boaz's wife and as the baby boy's mother, it's Naomi that remains the weakest and most vulnerable character in the story, the childless widow. So by focusing on Naomi's happiness, the narrator shows us that Naomi is no longer vulnerable. And especially the genealogy says that. The genealogy nicely brings us to the final correspondence between the opening and closing chapters. We had 10 years of barrenness and death in the prologue of the book. And now that is matched in the epilogue by 10 generations of birth and life. Childlessness, even Naomi's childlessness, is reversed. Now, the belief that God is the agent by which conception happens is not restricted to the book of Ruth. Just as much as God intervenes to reverse Ruth's barrenness, God plays a part in the stories of other childless women who conceived, the matriarchs. The matriarchs were well known, each of them, for a wonder child. Sarah's little boy arrived when she had crossed 90 and changed her cackle of disbelief to the laughter of delight. Rebecca, she needed Isaac to pray away her infertility. Leah's series of baby boys was made possible because God wished to compensate her for a husband whose attentions were permanently captured by his younger wife. As for Rachel, her turn came only after long years of envious fretting. And then, in the days of the judges, God sends a long childless couple the gift of the miracle child Samson. A little later, Hannah's anguished plea in the tabernacle in Shiloh is answered with pregnancy, and she gratefully recognizes God's doing by naming him God Hears. When a wealthy woman in Shunem hears her guest, the prophet Elisha, bless her with news of an imminent baby, she's almost afraid to trust that it can be so. "Don't mislead your servant, O man of God," she exclaims. And in the New Testament, the aged and childless Zechariah cannot believe his ears at the news of a son, and as a sign, must be struck dumb. All this said, there remains a corollary to childlessness that rears its ugly head both in biblical Israel and in present-day India. That corollary is the stigma, the shame of being barren. And so when Elizabeth gratefully acknowledges the divine hand in her pregnancy, she makes a remark that Indian women would spontaneously resonate with. "The Lord has done this for me," Elizabeth says. "He has taken away my disgrace among the people." In popular Hinduism, the disgrace of childlessness would usually be traced back to misdeeds in the past life, one's bad karma. "I don't know what I did in my previous life to deserve this," one might say. Infertility becomes something to be ashamed about, a disgrace. And how beautifully God addresses this in a deeply countercultural manner. Referring to eunuchs, male slaves who were castrated, he says, "Let not the eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. For this is what the Lord says, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me, and hold fast to my covenant, to them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will not be cut off." Isaiah 56. Blessing does not lie necessarily in bearing children. At least that's how the Old Testament ends. And the New Testament only reinforces that. And so we move on to our third theme, the son, Ruth. Now, the book of Ruth in my country is hugely popular at women's Bible studies and women's retreats. It's a women's book. Uh, it makes only an occasional appearance at the Sunday pulpit. But in both places, at least in India, the character Ruth is made prescriptive to women. Be like Ruth. But I suspect that the list of virtues read off the biblical Ruth is deeply skewed by cultural values. So before I come to that, let me tell you the story of an ideal Indian wife, the Hindu counterpart to the woman of worth, the wife in Proverbs 31. And this story is embedded in the grand and convoluted narrative of the ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata. It is the story of a woman named Savitri. Savitri is a princess, born to a childless king after long years of dedicated prayer. She was everything he wished for, beautiful in form and face, as in spirit. When she came of age, Savitri chose herself a husband, a certain Satyavan, a prince whose family had lost their kingdom and had been exiled to a forest. Now, what was even more undesirable was that this prince was under the sad fate of dying young. But Savitri would not be dissuaded by either her father or his advisors. The marriage went ahead, and Savitri and Satyavan lived happily for a year in the husband's home deep in the forest, and she dedicated herself to his service and to the service of his aged parents, which included a blind father-in-law. Secretly, Savitri kept up a routine of pujas. Pujas are religious rituals and penances against the dreaded day of Satyavan's death. And on that day, on the appointed day, the expected happened. Yama, the terrifying god of the underworld, arrived, and flicking Satyavan's life into his black noose, he turned back towards his dark dominions, only to discover that Savitri was doggedly following him. The only way to dissuade her from entering the realms forbidden to the living was to bribe her with 3 wishes. So he granted her 3 wishes. Savitri started with a fairly innocent wish. She asked first for the restoration of sight to her blind father-in-law. She was granted that. And next, she asked to regain the lost kingdom. And she was granted that. For the 3rd wish, she made a move that the god of death had not seen coming. She asked that the kingdom, the regained kingdom, would enjoy the rule of Savitri and Satyavan's sons. The Dark Lord had to concede defeat, so he returned life into Satyavan's body, and the royal couple went on to live long and live well. The story of Savitri has spilled over from generation to generation, with each telling reinforcing the profile of the ideal wife. I remember reading it in comic book form when I was in my preteens. Married women in India are encouraged to emulate Savitri. She is the ideal, the perfect wife. Like her, a wife should make her husband's welfare the purpose of each day. She should see that no need of his goes unmet. She should undertake fasts for his well-being. She should consider her life expendable in the endeavor to save him from harm. And it goes without saying that her parents-in-law should take up the rest of her attention. Indian Christians absorb the Savitri ideal from the culture, inevitably, since they are immersed in it. So what implications may this have for the Indian Christian reading of the story of Ruth? To answer that question, we must consider how Indian church teaches and preaches the book of Ruth. Here is the ideal daughter-in-law, we are told. The virtue to note is her devotion to her husband's family. She leaves her birth family to cleave to her in-laws, to Naomi. And then she proceeds to serve her mother-in-law with such dedication that her future husband's community, Boaz's community, hears of it and shakes its head in amazed approval. Here, we note especially Ruth's dogged devotion to her mother-in-law. She does not take a step out of the home without her mother-in-law's permission. She reports all her doings to her mother-in-law. She obeys her mother-in-law without question. She labors from morning to evening to ensure that there's food on the table. So what are the virtues prescribed from the book of Ruth to women? Obedience, submission, devotion, service. These are the markers of a good daughter-in-law and perhaps even of a good woman. That is what Ruth looks like when we read her through the filter of cultural desirables. And reading her so, we forget all the rest that Ruth is. We forget that Ruth is a feisty woman, a woman who takes challenges head on. She has courage, as she demonstrates with Boaz at the threshing floor. Ruth is enterprising, though a foreigner in a community not friendly to her. She's a Moabite in Bethlehem. She dares to request the foreman of the field for special permission to glean among the sheaves. Ruth is ingenious. In chapter 3, she improvises on her mother-in-law's instruction and reminds Boaz that he is her kinsman redeemer. Courage, enterprise, and cleverness are perhaps traditionally attached to males rather than to females. Who knew that virtue has gender? When evident in women, these characteristics could be unsettling and even threaten the male. The Ruth story is subversive of culture. What a pity that we Indian Christians often transpose the prescriptions made from the Savitri story onto Ruth. How corrective of culture it would be if Ruth could be recognized for all her virtues. The chorus of Bethlehem women get it right. Ruth embodies all that is culturally desirable in a son. In South Asia, we probably appreciate Ruth for all the wrong reasons. So in conclusion, 3 elements that we've picked up from a South Asian reading of Ruth. 1, no other biblical book deals so extensively and in such painful detail on widowhood. 2, not many other books present as persistently as Ruth the theme of childlessness. 3, no other book is so enthusiastically prescribed to young Christian women for emulation. Prescriptions that seem to be less biblically faithful and more culturally convenient. All 3 elements sit within the matrix of community, the character that we spoke about at the start. All 3 elements sit within the matrix of community, that collective character that weaves in and out of its 4 chapters. Community that buzzes with perhaps gossipy excitement that a long-absent Bethlehemite has appeared at the town gate. It doesn't seem to bother itself with setting the law into motion to effect the land redemption law or the levirate law. It's a sadly real community with the possibility that a female foreigner, especially a Moabite, could be molested in the harvest fields. Its members, like the unnamed nearest kinsman redeemer in chapter 4, make cold calculations rather than warm responses to the opportunity to come to the aid of a poor relative. But it's also a community that appreciates the newly arrived foreigner in town, and even though she is Moabite, they are willing to give her credit for all that she has done for the family of Elimelech, and especially for Naomi. It's a community where the foreman of a work gang of harvesters is kind enough to allow a stranger special gleaning privileges. It's a community that warmly welcomes the Moabite into marriage with one of their socially respected members, Boaz. It's a community that rejoices at the happy circumstances of an elderly and childless widow, Naomi. The biblical narrator shows his readers the community of Bethlehem, warts and all. And with the three elements I've picked up, it appears that community did well with some things and not so well with some things. And so the book of Ruth encourages us, 21st century reading communities, to introspectively engage. In South Asia, Ruth asks our church communities to engage with widows who are resigned to their vulnerability, to engage with childless women who are persuaded that they are irreparably inadequate, to engage with women who are laboring under culturally convenient prescriptions favoring patriarchy. I wonder what might emerge from your community reading of the book of Ruth. Thank you.
If you look just on the other side of this arch at the bottom panel, that is a panel that tells the story of Ruth. And so you can see the panel up there. In Hebrew underneath it is a edited version of chapter 1, verse 16 that says basically has the Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi, telling Naomi that wherever you go, I'll go. Your home will be my home. Or where you stay, I'll stay, I should say. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. So for what it's worth, that's up there. And with that, we'll start. What languages do you publish in?
I should apologize. Only English, I'm afraid.
Why is that?
That's the legacy of the colonizer. No.
That's the language of the colonizer. The legacy.
Yeah, and we rejoice in it. It's just that in urban mission schools, such as the one that I was sent to, an all-girls school, by the way, we ended up learning not just to read and write in English, but also to think in English. So much so that my vernacular kind of got edged to the periphery, and I've never been able to gain the fluency required to write in it. I can read, I can speak, but not write in it.
Okay. My mom asked the question, what Bible translation do you use for your own study?
That sounds like, what would you recommend to everybody in this place? Yeah, like that. As someone who used to be on the translation committee of the NIV, I have learned that there is a Bible translation to suit every person. So I wouldn't recommend any one. There is no perfect one. And so I'd say go look at the translation philosophies. Are they doing sense for sense or word for word? And see where you want to fit in. I'd recommend that if you were going to preach or if you're going to teach in a small Bible study group, do a few translations chosen from different parts of that spectrum, maybe a word for word kind of translation, alongside a sense for sense translation. At this end might be the King James family, at the other end might be your NET, NLT. Use across the spectrum. Maybe do 3 Bible translations side by side, English versions side by side, so that you get a full sense of what perhaps is sitting in the Hebrew that's behind them all. Is that helpful?
Yeah,
I didn't say what I use, but yeah.
That was a helpful dodge. And no, so I did not know you were on the translation committee for the NIV.
Yeah.
Did you work on Ruth?
No, the standing committee now for the NIV, they only look at texts that need updating, yeah.
Consider.
Not on whole books.
Yeah, got it. All right, if you were sitting with a widow in Southeast Asia, what message from God would you give?
Okay, now I come from South Asia, which is a little different from the cultures in Southeast Asia, so they're not to be confused.
Okay, so South Asia.
South Asia, so I'm talking about that stretch from Nepal down through India to Sri Lanka with Pakistan on one side and Bangladesh on the other side. This is what we call the Indian subcontinent, so I'm talking about the cultures in this part of the world, the most populous part of the world. So if I was sitting down with a widow, what would I?
What would you say to the widow? How would you offer her comfort? And they actually broke down the question if the widow was a Christian or if the widow was Hindu or Muslim.
It would vary. So if the widow was a Hindu, there'd be a whole lot to say in terms of dismantling her worldview and her understanding of her place in society. If it was an Indian Christian widow, we wouldn't have so much work to do. But here, let me share what happened in my family. My grandmother was widowed early, and she had a lot to do with my upbringing. She lived close by to where we were, and so I valued her greatly. I remember when it came to my wedding, it was an arranged marriage, by the way, at age 21. Much like Ruth, Naomi arranged it, didn't she? Like that. So when it came to my wedding, it was a date in June that had been agreed upon. Suddenly, towards the end of May, my grandmother vanished. And we came to understand from the neighbors, this was a time when there were no mobile phones and she didn't bother to tell us where she was going. She had gone off on a little trip by herself to another city, to Bombay, simply because she wanted to remove herself from the preparations for my wedding and even from the event itself, because she thought being a widow would cast a shadow over my future happiness, maybe. So that's how strongly Indian Christians still continue to be influenced by popular Hinduism. So what would we tell a widow? Well, it would depend on where they are in their understanding of God, or whether that's a Christian God or a Hindu God, and we take it from there. There's no one blanket answer, I don't think.
That's fair. Could Ruth have run the risk of getting in trouble with the community for her boldness?
The boldness in chapter 2, maybe you were thinking chapter 3. In chapter 2, she makes bold to go and ask the manager of the harvesting gang for special gleaning rights. You didn't usually go up and glean among the sheaves that were being bundled. You just stayed behind the reapers and then just picked up whatever had been left behind. So that's something the man points out to Boaz. He said, she asked permission and now she's been working all day, she's taking a little rest. So that's bold, especially because she was a Moabite. And Moabites, they have a very bad reputation in Israel. Now, in chapter 3, the threshing floor incident, what's the question again? Could she have been...
Would she have risked community backlash for her boldness?
Yeah. At harvesting time, as at sheep shearing time, the only women you'd see in these places were prostitutes. And so she was really risking her reputation. So that's why she goes after dark. She goes in when it's dark, the meal has been eaten, and the men are getting ready to lie down and sleep. And so that's why she looks carefully to identify Boaz in the dark. All cats are gray. Yeah, so she has to make sure she finds the right man to go up to. And yeah, so it's a lot of risk. And you'll remember that Boaz, on the other hand, also says to her, lie here till it's dawn, and then let's get you out of here quickly before anyone can see you. So what she's doing, that's why I said, Naomi, it's a really dodgy scheme. It could have endangered Ruth if some other men had found her, you see. So she could definitely have risked her reputation. And here we must remember that Moabites especially don't have a good rep at all because of the story that surrounds their very origin, the origin story. Lot lying with his own daughters, being tricked, that was a bad trick, with his own daughters, and that union results in Ammon and in Moab, you see. So even the origin story is such a bad one that people would say, she's a Moabite. What better could you expect of her? Yeah.
All right, the next question then is a good one to follow. Ruth was a Moabite, and the Levitical law doesn't seem to permit Moabites to worship in the temple for 10 generations. Was Ruth allowed to worship under special permission because of her faith? Well, of course, the temple wasn't built, but the Levitical law would have applied to a tabernacle set up. Do you have any opinions on that?
Let's think. As for entry into the tabernacle, see, now by marrying Boaz, she would have become eligible to be part of the community. If it was a Moabite male, then Leviticus would have applied down to the 10th generation even. But being a woman, it was marriage that would have changed that.
Do you know,
But if you're talking about the temple later on, now in this time, this is the time of the judges, so there's still a tabernacle. But you must remember that in the temple, women were allowed to go only in, up to what? The outer court? No, the outer court was the court of the Gentiles, wasn't it? And then there was another court, and then the women stopped there, and then the men. So there was segregation there.
These are really tough questions just to spring on someone, but she teaches Hebrew.
Who has traveled so long and far and is jet lagged.
Yes. So I'm gonna read it. Is the word for virtuous in Hebrew translated virtuous for women, but courageous for men?
Oh, that's interesting. See, the book of Ruth does well with that. When Boaz is introduced in chapter 2, he's described as an ish chayil. Chayil being how shall we translate? A man of standing or a man of worth. Now that can be read in several ways. It can be a virtuous man, or more in communities, it's more a man who is respected, who has honor, a man who the community looks up to, a man of standing. So that's Boaz in chapter 2. And by the time you come to the threshing floor incident in chapter 3, Boaz says to Ruth that she is an eshet chayil, a woman of worth, a woman of standing. And that's high praise for a woman who, till now, has been introduced as a Moabite, as a daughter-in-law of Naomi, nothing much more than that. And by the time you reach chapter 3, here is Israelite of standing, calling her a woman of standing. And that's why in the Hebrew canon, Ruth is placed just after Proverbs. You know how Proverbs 31 has the virtuous woman, the Eshet Chayil. It has the description of the woman of virtue. And it's almost as if, in placing the book of Ruth after the book of Proverbs, the canon is saying, well, here is the story of a woman of worth. one who fleshes out, embodies Proverbs 31. So Chayil has to be read in its context, and here in both places, whether for Boaz or for her, it would mean a woman who has standing in the community. Now that's really big for someone who is a woman, not a man, and a Moabite rather than an Israelite. For her to gain that position by chapter 3, that's really big.
Okay. Was Ruth forcibly taken from her home? Was she a victim of abuse, given her 10 years of childlessness? Not sure all of that plugs in, but I think some of it's answered by, Naomi gave Ruth and both daughters-in-law a chance to go back to their people, and Ruth made the choice.
Yeah, in Judaism, especially in rabbinic Judaism, when a proselyte came along and asked to be converted, you were supposed to turn the proselyte away, the one who would be a proselyte. You were supposed to turn that seeker away 3 times. And if he turned up a 4th time, then you said, all right, come on in. And that comes from here, from Ruth, that Naomi 3 times asks Ruth to return, and Ruth doesn't. And then finally, Naomi has nothing more to say, and then they proceed towards Bethlehem. So given that, I don't think Ruth was coerced in any way.
Yeah. If the part of the verse that I left out of the Hebrew up there says, do not ever urge me to go or desert your side and leave you. And so it's part and parcel of Ruth saying, wherever you go, I'll go. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. But part of that was also, please don't urge me to go. Don't.
Yeah. In fact, it says, and Ruth made up her mind. It's pretty strong in the Hebrew. Ruth had determined in her mind that she would follow Naomi.
Okay, would you join me in giving her a thank you one more time?
Thank you. Thank you.